Just a few days remain. The 2026 World Cup is about to begin. Billions of people will be watching. The biggest stadiums across North America will light up. The world's biggest stars will step onto the pitch. But behind the festive atmosphere, something else is happening. A quiet confrontation is unfolding. And this time, the target is not a national team. It is FIFA. For months, Europe's top leagues, player unions, and some of the most powerful football organizations in the world have been openly criticizing FIFA. They are not simply voicing concerns, they are filing lawsuits. They are calling on European regulators to intervene. They are accusing FIFA of putting commercial interests ahead of the well-being of players and domestic competitions. These are no longer complaints on social media. These are real legal battles. What makes it even more remarkable is that all of this is happening just before the biggest World Cup in history. A World Cup featuring 48 national teams, 104 matches, and projected revenues worth billions of dollars. The question is no longer who will win the 2026 World Cup. The real question is this: is FIFA losing the support of the very European football powers that helped build the modern game? And if that is true, then this could be the beginning of the biggest crisis world football has ever faced. It did not begin with a press conference. It did not begin with a social media post. And it did not begin with calls for a boycott. It began with a legal filing sent to Brussels. In October 2024, the two most influential organizations representing players and domestic leagues in Europe took an unprecedented step. They formally filed a complaint against FIFA with the European Commission. On one side was FIFPro Europe, the organization representing professional players' unions. On the other was European Leagues, the body representing dozens of national football leagues across Europe. When those two organizations stand together, it is no longer a routine disagreement. It becomes a legal declaration of war. At the heart of the complaint is a simple question: who is really benefiting from the ever-expanding World Cup? FIFA argues that increasing the tournament to 48 teams will help grow football around the world. More countries will have the opportunity to participate. More matches will be played. More fans will be able to engage with the tournament. On the surface, it sounds entirely reasonable, but Europe's domestic leagues see a very different picture. They argue that FIFA has continued expanding international competitions to generate more revenue, while the clubs and domestic leagues are the ones paying the price. More matches mean less time for recovery. More tournaments mean an increasingly congested calendar. And in the end, it is the clubs that continue paying the salaries of players who are being pushed to their physical limits. But what makes this dispute especially serious is the legal argument behind it. According to the complaint, FIFA is operating under a fundamental conflict of interest. On one hand, FIFA serves as the governing body of world football. It writes the rules. It determines the calendar. It controls the system. But on the other hand, FIFA is also the organization that directly profits from the competitions it creates and manages. In other words, the rule maker is also the primary beneficiary of those rules. That is why the complaint uses a particularly sensitive phrase, abuse of a dominant position. This is not the language of frustrated fans. It is the language of European competition law. If regulators ultimately accept that argument, FIFA could face significant pressure to change the way global football is governed in the future. And that is what makes this story so important. The 2026 World Cup will still take place. The matches will still be played. The stadiums will still be packed with fans. But for the first time in many years, FIFA is not simply defending a tournament. It is defending the very system through which it governs the world's most popular sport. But if the lawsuit brought by Europe's domestic leagues is a battle over power, then the next battle may be even more important, because it involves the people who make the World Cup possible, the players. For years, fans have grown accustomed to football becoming increasingly crowded with matches. The Champions League expanded. Domestic competitions grew longer. International breaks became more frequent. And then came the 48-team World Cup. At first glance, it simply looks like more football. But for the players, it means something very different. Less time to rest, less time to recover, and a greater risk of injury than ever before. That is why a new fight has emerged. Not on the pitch, but within the organizations that represent and protect players. In early 2026, France's Professional Players Union took the issue to an entirely new level. They argued that the current football calendar has gone beyond what can reasonably be considered safe for the health and well-being of professional athletes. In other words, this is no longer just a football issue. It is a labor rights issue. Their complaint was formally accepted for review by a European-level institution. For the first time in football history, a players' organization used Europe's social rights protection mechanisms to challenge the way international football is governed. That alone shows how serious the situation has become, because when a player walks onto the field, fans only see 90 minutes of action. What they do not see are the thousands of minutes spent training, traveling, and recovering behind the scenes. A modern football season can now stretch across almost the entire year. Many elite players compete in more than 60 matches every season. Some exceed that number by a significant margin. And as FIFA continues to expand international competitions, an uncomfortable question begins to emerge. Where is the limit? Are players genuinely being consulted before the calendar becomes even more congested? Or are they simply expected to adapt to decisions made far above them? That is why this debate continues to grow. Because behind the packed stadiums and the billions of dollars in revenue, a much deeper argument is taking place over who is paying the price for the relentless expansion of modern football. And many people believe the answer is the players. Debates about fixture congestion can sound dry and technical. Lawsuits, legal filings, meetings between football organizations. But sometimes, one injury is enough to make the issue feel very real. That is exactly what happened with Rodri. For years, the Spanish midfielder was regarded as one of the most reliable players in world football. He was almost always available, always performing at the highest level, always an irreplaceable piece of the system. Then everything changed. A serious knee ligament injury brought his season to an abrupt end. Almost immediately, the debate over the football calendar exploded once again. Because not long before that injury, Rodri had issued a public warning. He said players were approaching their physical limits, and if things continued in the same direction, a strike could eventually become a real possibility. Those words carried weight, not because they came from a retired player, not because they came from a television pundit, but because they came from one of the biggest stars in modern football. What makes the story even more significant is that Rodri is far from the only example. In recent years, the list of players dealing with physical breakdowns has continued to grow. Muscle injuries, ligament injuries, exhaustion after long seasons. Cases that once seemed isolated are appearing more and more frequently. And that is what worries so many people. Because the 2026 World Cup is not arriving after a normal season. It comes after years of continuous expansion, more tournaments, more matches, more travel, more pressure. While the human body still has limits that cannot be negotiated, that is why the conflict between FIFA and player organizations is not simply about money or power. At its core, it revolves around a much simpler question. How much further can football continue to grow before the people who play it begin paying an unbearable price? And as the opening day of the World Cup draws closer, that question remains unanswered. In fact, for many observers, it is becoming the biggest ticking time bomb in modern football. While the battle over players' rights continues to intensify, another controversy suddenly emerged. This time, it involved France, one of the leading contenders to win the 2026 World Cup. The French Football Federation was reportedly unhappy with its group stage travel schedule. The national team is expected to play in several different cities across the northeastern United States. According to French officials, the travel demands could affect preparation and player recovery. At first glance, that sounds like a reasonable concern, but many people saw it differently because the cities involved are not actually that far apart. These are not cross-continental journeys. They are not flights covering thousands of miles. For many Americans, those travel distances are comparable to the routine schedules followed by professional sports teams every season. And that is where a problem begins to emerge. When complaints like these appear at the same time as major legal battles over player welfare, the line between two very different conversations starts to blur. On one side are serious concerns about player health, the growing number of matches, the increasing risk of injury and burnout. On the other side is one of the world's top national teams expressing frustration with its tournament itinerary. Those are not the same issue, and mixing them together can weaken the impact of the arguments that matter most. Yet the situation reveals just how much tension exists ahead of the 2026 World Cup. Because when pressure reaches a certain level, even relatively small concerns can quickly become major headlines. And while the media focuses on France's travel schedule, another controversy is quietly spreading behind the scenes. One that is far more sensitive, a controversy involving visas, double standards, and the way world football treats different nations. But perhaps the issue that frustrates many people in Europe the most is not the schedule, not the number of matches, and not the long flights across continents. It is something else entirely, a simple but uncomfortable question. Are FIFA and international football authorities applying the same standards to everyone? Or are some countries being treated differently from the rest? This debate became increasingly heated as visa issues entered the conversation ahead of the 2026 World Cup. Fans from certain nations that qualified for the tournament faced greater obstacles when trying to enter the host country. For many people, this was not merely a bureaucratic issue. It was a question of fairness, because for decades, the World Cup has been promoted as a global celebration of football, a tournament where every nation has the right to participate, a stage where every fan should have the opportunity to be part of the experience. But when some supporters face significant challenges simply trying to attend matches and support their teams, difficult questions begin to emerge. And those questions become even more sensitive when people look back at recent history. In 2022, Russian football was removed from international competitions with remarkable speed. Football authorities acted quickly, they acted decisively, and they acted publicly. Many people supported those decisions. Many others did not. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. Football demonstrated that it was willing to take strong action when it chose to do so. And that leads directly to the most difficult question of all. If decisive action is possible in one situation, why does silence appear in others? That argument is becoming increasingly common in football debates across Europe. Not everyone agrees with it, but it is no longer easy to ignore, because once trust begins to erode, the issue is no longer about a single decision. It becomes a question of consistency, a question of whether the same principles are being applied equally to everyone. And for any organization, that is always a dangerous moment, because authority is not built on rules alone. It is built on trust. For decades, FIFA has argued that football has the power to unite the world. But now, just before the biggest World Cup in history, more and more people are asking a different question. What happens when trust in the people running the game begins to decline? And that may be the greatest challenge FIFA faces today. Not on the field, but beyond it, only a few days remain. Soon, the debates will give way to the opening whistle. Legal complaints will temporarily give way to starting lineups, and billions of people will do what they always do during a World Cup: watch football. Because no matter how many controversies unfold away from the field, the ball will still roll. Kylian Mbappe will still take the field. Goals will still be scored. And a world champion will still be crowned on the final day of the tournament. But when we look back at everything that happened before the 2026 World Cup, the most significant story may not be the outcome of the tournament itself, It may be the questions that were asked along the way. European leagues openly challenged FIFA. Player organizations pushed labor rights issues into the legal arena. Debates about fairness, double standards, and power became increasingly intense. These were not isolated events. They were signs that more and more people want a greater voice in how football is governed. Perhaps FIFA will overcome these challenges just as it has many times before. But it is also possible that the 2026 World Cup will be remembered as the moment when a deeper transformation began, not on the pitch, but inside boardrooms, regulatory institutions, and the organizations shaping the future of the sport. Because the biggest question surrounding the 2026 World Cup may not be who lifts the trophy. It may be something far more important. Who will shape the future of world football in the years ahead?